Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Today I got a great one for you. This is part 2 on a series of light. We're talking about direct unfiltered light versus diffused filtered light. And I got a ton of examples. You're going to love this one right after this. Need you to stay tuned for this whole video. I've got examples, illustrations, I've got real life photos. We're going to talk about light some more today, and I've made this point before. There's a lot of videos out there. We talk about everything, but not enough about light. And I'm breaking it down for you. I think this is going to be a great series for beginners, intermediates, and yes, even experienced photographers. You may look at this and say, yeah, this guy's right about some stuff. So we're going to kind of jump right in here and just talk about the type of light. In the last video, I talked about hue, tone, discussed things like golden hour, blue hour, hard light. And I even gave some direct comparisons where I showed you the same species and what it looks like in different light. And I hope you found that one helpful. And in that theme of practical images, I've got more for you today. I'm going to show you side by sides, and I'm going to show you what things look like in different light. And this is really all about light that is now beyond tone. So we're past those low angle sunlights, and now the sun has started to rise. And we're going to talk about the difference between the direct, unfiltered, I might call it hard or harsh light during this video as well, versus diffused light that is a little softer and subtle. And there's advantages and disadvantages for both types of light. And I'm going to explain all that to you today, but I'm going to jump right into my other screen here. So I got my friend Bob here. Don't have a better name. If you got a better name, put one down in the comments. What I did is I set him up in my basement on a perch, and I put a spotlight on him. I played around with the light. I wanted to make it look like something a wildlife photographer might see. I will tell you, this isn't too far off. It doesn't have a lot of tone, so you can see it's white, it's bright. There's not a tone or a hue to it. You could also see the strong shadows, and this is unfiltered. So this is just the light shining right on it. And as I added this diffusion to it, I was attempting to simulate what clouds might look like, or even stronger shade. And it was pretty effective. I'll be honest, I was pretty pleased with the results. I think you're gonna find this interesting. The first thing I did is place bubble wrap around it. And this bubble wrap just added just a little bit of filtration. Watch very carefully here. You just see that? I'll go back and forth. That's unfiltered. This is the slightest bit of filtering. This would represent like a small haze over the sun. Let me go one more. Now I take a piece of thin paper and I pop it in front. This drops, by the way, my shutter speed. I started at 1/400th of a second. I went down to 1/200th of a second with the bubble wrap. I'm now down to 1/125th of a second. And you could see the difference. Let me just toggle from the very first one. See the hard shadow? You're starting to see it now. And you could see some of that other side starting to be brought in. That's because the exposure is getting more even. From the brightest part to the darkest part, there's not as much contrast. So, pretty good example so far. I'm at 1/125th of a second, ISO 400 for this. Now, here's what I do. I slip some dark paper, a really heavy paper over it. And this simulates really dark clouds or even shade. And this drops the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. Dramatic difference here. And I'm gonna go close in on this when I go through the second round to show you noise. But let me just show you real quickly what that looks like here. All right, so watch the difference. That was the 1/125th. This is light paper, kind of simulating light clouds. And then these are the heavy, dark clouds being simulated. Pretty true. Notice the eye, the eye, and I'll highlight it right here. It's on the screen, it'll be the right eye. When I take this and go to the other exposure, notice it's dark there behind the eye. There's a shadow there. Now watch that shadow disappear, and you can almost see the eye shining through a little bit. I thought that was a really good example. Notice the far eye right now. It is generally exposed, and the exposure between both sides is pretty even. If I go back, notice that eye on the other side now is really, really, really dark. Because it's in shadow, makes a significant difference. We'll talk about why this matters and some of the applications in just a second. But I just wanted to start with these examples. Now, the second thing I did is I ran the same series. So I did the same set of papers, these diffused papers. And now I did it by keeping the shutter speed the same. For songbirds, for me, 1/400th of a second is a fine setting. So I put it at 1/400th of a setting. I will tell you this, in natural light, my ISO would be very low right now. I would be at like 100 ISO because I'm shooting this indoors with a small light, just very close. I'm not getting as much ambient light. And you see that because the background has been blacked out. It's a pretty good illustration though of the difference in ISO. So the change in ISO as we add some shade in here. All right, so I'm ISO 500, 1/400th of a second. I add that first real light bubble wrap. It goes up to 720 ISO. I add that second one. Now this one is a little more diffused, I think, than the first time I did it. It went up to 1800 ISO. So I'm starting to push my ISO. For a lot of photographers, 1600 starts to get uncomfortable. Let me zoom in and show you what the noise looks like at 1800 ISO. Okay, it's not terrible. You will start to see it, but watch what happens when I add that heavy piece of paper in front. Look at how balanced it is. Now you can actually see the spotlight. I think it reflected off the paper, so I apologize for that. But notice the light on the bird. It's very even. Left and right now, the exposures are the same. There's almost no shadow here at all. And there are benefits to this. But if we look closely, one of the downfalls is we've introduced a lot of noise. Now we're at ISO 6400. And by the way, this is not uncommon if you are shooting dark areas, even during the daytime, but dark shaded areas, 1/400th of a second, your ISO could push up as high as 6400. It might be a little darker in this image, but it is not impossible to think of that. And if you had your shutter speed higher, like 800th of a second, you would get this ISO. 6400 would be very typical of what you might see in dark shade. So for this purpose, again, it's not scientific, it's not exact, but I'm going to scroll you back through and you'll see that this, look at the beginning. It's a good illustration of what diffused light starts to do. That's the ending. That's the beginning, that hard, strong light, lots of shadows, very sharp angles on the shadow from the beak. And then here, no shadows at all. Now there are benefits to this and there are downfalls. And the biggest downfall is the introduction of noise and the loss of image quality. If we want to keep that ISO low, we got to drop our shutter speeds down almost so low that they're not usable. And I'm not afraid to go down to 100th of a second sometimes, but it gets really, really hard to capture images at 100th of a second on things like songbirds. Now, I've got a video coming up that talks about my favorite light for different birds and different species, but I will tell you this. Diffused light is my preference for songbirds, and that's why I chose this example. I'm going to show you some real life examples of other types in just a second. I've got two more things to finish up on this sequence. Now let me introduce a background. So I want you to notice about this light. It's a hard light, unfiltered, very flat, doesn't have a lot of tone, hard shade, but watch the background. We talked about the subject so that we know what goes on with the subject already. Let's talk about the background. Notice how flat the greens and purples are. I'm going to detail this in just a second. When I put it in shade or dark clouds, there's a big difference. Not just with the subject. We've already talked about the subject. The subject now has that even exposure, no shade, no shadows. Look at the background. I'm going to toggle it off. Pay attention to the green. See the difference in the green? And one thing about shooting in overcast light, the subject tends to get kind of flat and it needs a little editing. So what I did is I said, let me show the team why I like to shoot songbirds. And I want you to pay attention because I got an image coming up, a real live image that illustrates this. But this is where I started with this background. This is the shaded background and this is the unshaded background. So this is a direct light. Notice the difference in the tone and the color, in the greens especially. And I thought, let me show the team why you need to bring some life to it. So you need a little editing. When you're shooting in diffused light, I'm going to tell you there are times, especially as it gets really, really dim, where you're going to have to bring some life back to the edit. So I tried both edits. I tried to deal with the problems of both edits. And here, phase one brought some life to it. Look at the vibrance. So I was able to bring life to the greens and the yellows. When I zoom in, I got a lot of noise. But here's the great thing. And we are lucky to be photographing at the time we do, because Topaz is a great product. I've endorsed it for years. I'll put a link down there if you're interested, because you're going to see the difference. If you've never used it, you'll see the difference here. Look at that. That's denoise. This is actually photo AI. It's integrated denoise into it. I'm going to zoom out. You can clearly see it here, but let me zoom out. And that's my finished edit. Like, that's no photoshopping this. This is just done kind of in Lightroom and photo AI. But look at how vibrant I was able to make that. So I've lost my shadows. And through just very simple editing techniques, I'm able to bring some life to this. Watch what I'm able to do with the hard light. Oh my gosh, look at the difference. You could see it, right? You can see the difference in that just saturation, that richness in the colors. The best I can do. So I go in and I try to remove some of the shadows. I pull down some of the highlights. I try to saturate that background. That's about the best I can do. I don't need denoise as much, or I don't need photo AI as much, because I'm starting with lower light. I didn't do any Photoshop manipulation. I just tried to play around with hue and color and contrast, pull up the shadows. Couldn't get it to look good. Look at the difference between the two edited versions. In shadow, or in shade, in direct sun. It is very difficult to make that direct hard light look good. Now, I know some of you are going to say, yeah, Scott, but the more light I get, the lower I keep that noise, and it looks like there's more detail there. Some of that is actually true. This is the image with the harder light. Now I'm going to zoom in on this one, and I'm going to get in pretty close here. Let's look at the feather details in the eyes. You can see there's actually pretty good details in there. This is a sharp lens. Let me go down and to the image that was in the shade. It's not going to look like there's as much detail in some of the feathers. It's just not. And it is going to require a little bit more editing to bring it to life. But when you do, I will tell you this, and some of you may say, I'm looking at these two and I like that we would call it the harder. I like this harder image better. If you like this one better, that's okay. I don't. I can tell you every day of the week that one looks better. It looks richer to me. So that's kind of the introduction to this. It's not real world yet. This is controlled. I'm trying to give you an example that shows you what the real life really starts to look like. But I'm not far off on this, because I'm going to start to show you now. Let me just pull up a different window. I'm going to start to show you some real life images. Now, this is a golden hour image. We talked about this in the last video. I'm going to show you how this compares, and it's a pretty stark comparison here. You're going to see it pretty quick, how different it looks in overcast light. I'm going to show you some waterfowl, and this is what they start to look like. The backgrounds can become very muted with waterfowl, especially at low angles. We don't have a lot to deal with. There's generally not trees. There's not richness and color around. Sometimes you get lucky and you can do this, but not always. Here you see that really diffused. By the way, the settings are underneath me for these images, so you'll get a chance to look at some of these settings. Very, very diffused. It can almost feel like it's high key. We'll explore that a little bit more. Here's a hooded merganser in overcast light. Very, very muted. Now the eye stands out really nice. Required a little bit of editing on this to bring up the eye and bring up some saturation. So these diffused lights, depending on how soft it is, there's a huge variance of how diffused it is. But if it gets really low, it can be very difficult to deal with. And remember, shutter speeds are coming way down and noise is going way up. It's going to require a little bit to deal with that. Now this I love. This is diffused light, but it's not that strong overcast, like real dark clouds. This is light clouds. And even though it's well before sunset, I'm getting decent shutter speed. So I really want you to pay attention to this. There's some green in the background. That works really, really well. So it's not that heavy. Remember I showed you those other images. It felt really kind of, the highlights were very light. I didn't get a lot of color, almost high key. Here I'm getting pretty good color on this, and it's just right. It's just enough shutter speed to capture the wings. They're not frozen, but it's just enough, and there's no shadows, and the light's not hard on it. Now, one of the things about this is you're going to notice these images lack the golden tone, but the soft light doesn't necessarily have to have golden tone to be pleasing. So there's not a golden tone here or even a bluish tone. It's just nice and soft and pretty. A couple more of these waterfowl images to show you. This one's in a heavier mist. So again, it lost the color. It doesn't have that with it. And then this one is high key. It's from a series I did with this long-tailed duck. I love this. This was 3 hours after sunrise. Extremely overcast day. And being low on the water, I was just able to kind of blow everything out and just capture this long-tailed duck in a very pretty high-key setting. So I really, really liked this in terms of waterfowl. Now, it's tough on birds in flight. This is an overcast image. It's actually raining in this image. It takes a little bit of processing to bring that to life. I had to kind of pull up some of the saturation on the eyes and the shadows on the bird. It's not ideal for birds in flight. It's very, very difficult. I have very few birds in flight images. You see, here's a bird in flight at hard light, and you can just see how much easier it is to freeze action. Here, fortunately, I'm getting my shutter speed up a little bit more. You can see the shutter speed over there. But I'm also having to boost this exposure in post-processing. So it's feeling a little dark. Now, let's talk about shorebirds. This one taken on an overcast day, a little bit of a glow there. But this is typical of what you'll see on overcast days with shorebirds, something like this. This actually gives a nice soft feel. It works well when the birds are really close. You'll see this in the songbirds. When the birds are really close and it's overcast, the backgrounds can be really pretty and really green. Again, I come back to that color of yellow and green, look really great in diffused light. They might need a little pop in editing, but they can look very, very good. We're going to finish with songbirds. It's my favorite light for songbirds. Diffused light. I actually remember this day. The light was just perfect. It was filtered by light clouds and some mist. And if you look at this, one of the reasons I love this image, it's not that I'm going to hang it on my wall, but notice that there's enough light for me to get sharp exposure, and it's not hard. There's no shadows. If you look at that stick, almost no shadows. Notice the greens are really vibrant. And that's just that soft, diffused light. It's absolutely perfect here. And I've got a couple of rules or a couple of things that I've observed over the years. Call this the keys factor. I want you to go out one day when you've got overcast light, and I want you to look at your shutter speed and your noise or your ISO. So look at those two components. And I've got this guideline that my shutter speed should be the inverse of my ISO. So what that means, if you do that, just take your ISO and put a 1 over top and make that your shutter speed. If ISO is 500, shutter speed is 1 over 500, 1/500th of a second. And as you change it, it'll change with it, right? So if you slow down your shutter speed, your noise will go down. 1/400th of a second, 400 ISO. 800th of a second, 800 ISO. I've noticed that is a really great proportion. It happens at f4, by the way. So if you're at f6, it might be a little skewed. And in the image we're looking at, we're pretty close to that. We're not exact, but we're pretty close to that. We're in that range. So if I'm around 1/400th of a second and my ISO is somewhere between 320 and 800, I'm right in a good spot. I'm going to show you a couple examples, and I'll put the shutter speeds and the ISOs, and you can see it fluctuates a lot with diffused light. But what I want you to pay attention to, the softness of the shadows and how pleasing those shadows are. It doesn't feel hard. If you think about this, if we're going to photograph a model, there's going to be a giant soft box, and it's going to be filtered. We are rarely, if ever, there are some applications, but rarely, if ever, are we going to take a hard light. Remember that first couple images I showed you of that hard light with the shadow on the bird and that really bright light. Not flattering. We're going to soften it up. In nature, things tend to be more pleasing when they're soft. Let's take another look. This one is actually, I think this follows the keys factor rule, 500 ISO, 1/500th of a second. Soft light. So it's around noon where I'm in the woods. It's nice and shaded. No shadows on this. Very, very pleasing. I love this because it's a native plant, and I like the scale of this. I've really liked this image for a long time. Again, it's not artwork. A lot of people, this might not be their preference. For me personally, and that's what I photograph to please me a lot. I really want to make images that I like, and I hope that my enthusiasm shows for others. I like this one. Photographing in the rain, but enough light to capture a decent image. So ISO gets a little higher, but not bad. Shooting this one at 2.8 because there's not a lot of available light, and you could see that, remember that rule, that inverse, that keys factor? Pretty close on this one. I'll put the settings over there. Diffused light, no hard shadows. Overcast right after the rain. Look at the glow in the greens. I wanted to put this in here specifically because I want people to see how these greens can really glow in diffused light. I think it's really, really, really just a pretty way to shoot. If I shot this in hard light, if I shot this in, kind of that direct, unfiltered light, boy, would this look unflattering. There would be shadows everywhere. It would just, I just wouldn't be able to do it. Here it looks pretty good. I got another black-throated green, and I'll look at the backgrounds. I just want you to pay attention to a couple things with these backgrounds real quick. You're going to start to see, remember I keep coming back to this theme of diffused light and greens. With songbirds, that's one of the advantages, is we typically deal with a lot of greens. Now in fall we may deal with other colors, in spring we may deal with some other colors, but we deal a lot with greens. When you're shooting overcast light and you're shooting things like shorebirds and there's not a lot of background there, that golden tone works really well, but the diffused light doesn't always work as well. And again, I'm not making it a rule. I'm just saying as a guideline, doesn't work very well. Let me show you this one. This is my backyard. Diffused light. Note that on the branch, there's no hard shadows. Note on the leaves, there's no hard shadows. On the bird, there's no hard shadows. There's a soft shadow underneath, just about the right amount of light. Doesn't necessarily have that same golden tone it would have right at when the sun comes up, but it's got a nice diffused light. This is in very, very low light. This is at daybreak, but there's no sun there. I laughed because somebody said, what did you do to Photoshop that? I wish I could show you the raw file. This is essentially the raw file with the bird brightened up a little bit. I added a little contrast and saturation, but this is a field of ferns. And when they're out of focus, this is what it looks like. But again, notice there's no hard shadows. Look at the underside of the bird here. No hard shadows. Everything just falls off nice and soft. And in this image, it's just pretty. Very slow shutter speed. Very overcast. But look at how the greens glow. Look at the moss. It takes a little bit of editing, but when you can bring it to life, and that's why I really preach that raw files out of the camera, they need some work. And when you're shooting a diffused light, if you're willing to invest a little bit of time, it doesn't take a lot. It's just saturation, a little bit on the whites, like pulling up some of these exposures, balancing it when needed. But if you just tweak it a little bit, it's really, really pretty. I don't do editing. I don't do much editing on YouTube. I have a Patreon site where I actually edit bird photos for people, and I put out videos about it. I'm not going to, kind of promote that right now, but I just want to explain why, because I do have two services, one free service here on YouTube, one subscription service on Patreon, and that's the intent of that service. So I know I'm mentioning the need to edit. I feel it's really, really important, whether you subscribe to my editing or you go out on your own and find YouTube videos or you have another mentor. I would really suggest just make sure you understand the basics. If there's some beginners out there, make sure you understand the basics of editing. You don't have to manipulate the image. You don't have to do a lot. This image isn't highly photoshopped. It's just learning how to deal with the colors. And I want to talk about color. I want a couple things. This is very overcast light. I want to show you a couple things with this. Again, no shadows, right? So I've eliminated shadows. Remember in that example, and I'll put it up here at the end. I'm going to kind of show you a couple illustrations, but I want you to think back to that in the color in the background. Remember when it was overcast and diffused, I said the color will radiate, especially if you just bring it up a little bit. These are autumn colors. This is a Lincoln sparrow, so it migrates in autumn. Look at those colors. Notice back here, though. See this area, this white area? This is kind of the danger, and this is why I don't like shooting things like shorebirds, things that don't have a backdrop. Some of those ducks you saw, it gets very just white. Now you can use that to your advantage. I showed you, right? You remember that long-tailed duck that I really, really love? You can use that to your advantage. It can kind of become a high key image, but it could lack color. The nice thing about songbirds is they're often around areas that have or can have pretty colors, and if nothing else, they should have some green leaves in there. So this is an image I wanted to finish on this because we've talked about the concept of evening out shadows on the bird with diffused light, but it also has this huge advantage in that some of the backgrounds can be really, really, really pretty. So those are the examples. I hope you appreciate that, and I hope it illustrates it. I am a visual learner, so when I see it, it clicks, and I hope some of that clicked for you. Now, this is the part of the video where I've introduced a lot of concepts, and I try to tie it all together. So I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons for each of these lights. This direct light, unfiltered, again, and we're talking when it's risen, when the sun is up in natural light, all of this talking about natural light. What are some of the pros for this? And there's going to be a few, and it's going to seem like it's a lot. What I warn you is, while there are a lot of pros, the cons are so weighted that to me the cons matter so much more than the pros. So here, let me give you the pros. You get a lot of it. And when you have a lot of light, you can increase your shutter speed to freeze action, and you can lower your ISO to reduce noise. So image quality can look pretty good. It can look pretty clean. It also gives you the ability to stop it down if you want. So if you want to play at different apertures, if you want to get more in focus, you can bring your lens to f8, f11, further down if you want to. With a lot of light, less expensive lenses aren't taxed as much. So meaning, more expensive lenses tends to have large apertures. So you're paying for the availability of light to gather light. Well, if there is a lot of light, you don't really need that feature as much. And so you can get away with a lens that might be like f6 or even f8. And those lenses tend to cost much less when you're looking at 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters, and 600 millimeters. So you can get away with less expensive lenses because there's just more light and it's not as taxing on the lenses. Now the downside, those shadows are brutal. Even in situations where the sun might be directional and you're not getting shadows, the light itself is just not flattering. It's very, very hard. Sometimes it's hard to express that to people if you use the words, but when you saw those images, and I'll put a couple of them up here on the slide, like you'll see it. Like notice, I'm going to put one here with the hard shadow and one with the diffused shadow. You see the difference in that light. It just doesn't feel hard when it's diffused and it's been cut out. Another thing about backgrounds, we didn't really mention it when we were talking about the examples, but I will tell you this. In the backgrounds you can get, or in the foregrounds or anywhere in the image, you can get these things called hotspots. Hotspots, like a shiny leaf, anything that has like a brightness to it, when the sun is hitting it directly, it'll really blow it up. It can lead to blowing out the highlights in those areas, and even on the subject. So in a tougher to expose subject, you might get just highlights that are completely blown out, or you might get these hotspots. Let's talk about diffused light real quick. With diffused light, you're going to minimize your shadows. It's going to give you a much softer, much more natural feel. You get a longer shooting time as opposed to golden hour and blue hour. Now, again, in direct light, whether there's clouds there or not, in theory, you can shoot all day, just different types of light. But in diffused light, it doesn't really matter where the sun is at. So if it's fairly low or middle, like getting high, if it's cut down with clouds or other, mist or haze, it tends to give you a lot of time to shoot. And that's a huge advantage, especially if the subjects are harder to find. Again, another reason why I love to shoot songbirds in that light. Backgrounds in color. I showed you an example here of how color can come to life even in diffused light. It takes a little bit of editing sometimes to do that, to bring it out. But when you bring it out, it looks really, really great. There's no hot spots. Now, are there some cons? Well, there's some pretty big ones. And some of these cons may be so tough for people to swallow, they might say, I can't do it. Some of it is a mindset. I have my style of shooting. Somebody else has a different style of shooting. What they see as aesthetically pleasing, I see as not. And what I may see as really beautiful, they may see as not. That doesn't add value to it. That doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. It's just how we perceive things. I don't like hard light. But when I'm dealing in that diffused light, I have to be comfortable with slower shutter speeds. I have to know that my noise is going to be higher. My image quality, and this is a tough one to say, my image quality could be less than if I had more light. And when you start talking about image quality, some people get so hung up on that concept that they can't get out of their head, and they feel they must have a certain shutter speed and they must have minimal noise, and therefore they must shoot in stronger light. And if you do that, you might not get some of the benefits of the soft light. The last drawback is a pretty big one on diffused light. It can require very expensive lenses. I shoot with a 400 2.8 because it allows in a lot of light. So if I'm in a low light situation, it's a little bit better. It focuses quicker and it cuts down on noise. And those lenses can get very, very expensive. So I'm listing that as a con as well. That's my video. A little bit long on this one. I didn't expect it to go quite this long, but I wanted to show those examples. I really feel I got to put the examples in there so people can see it and understand the concept. If somebody's just talking about it, you don't always get it. It's easy for me to just say, hey, go shoot in diffused light. It's easy. It softens the images, blah, blah, blah. What does it really look like? So I hope you appreciated that. I hope you like this series on light. I got more videos coming out on this one. So if you're not subscribed, I need you to hit that subscribe button, but more importantly, hit the notification. Even if you're subscribed, that lets you know a new video is out. I'm putting out a video about every 2 weeks. If I'm lucky, maybe I get an extra one in there now and then, but I hope you appreciate that. I really do appreciate you tuning into the whole series. Looking forward to doing a couple more of these. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.